Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. I'm just going to start off by saying that the internet does seem to be a little bit choppy this afternoon, so bear with us. As the title suggests, I'm going to be joined by Justin Brierley, who I'm sure many of you know. Justin Brierley is a broadcaster, a writer, a speaker on apologetics and theology. He's the director of Think Faith, and you can find his channel, Justin Brierley Think Faith, on YouTube. If you've not already subscribed, please do so. He's the author of books such as The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God and Why I'm Still a Christian. And he also hosts the Surprising Rebirth documentary podcast, as well as having just launched the Uncommon Ground show. And so many of you might know him from Premier Christian Radio. And we're going to be talking today about the quiet revival and how we can harvest the quiet revival. And Justin's very good at platforming other people to talk about this, but I thought it'd be nice to hear from Justin and to hear his opinions on the topic. If you're blessed by what I'm doing and you want to help support the ministry, having prayed about it, please do, if you feel led, use the links in the description box below to support the work and the ministry that I do. But without any further ado, I'm going to bring on Justin. How are you doing, Justin?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Bob. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and glad to finally have you on the channel. It's a real privilege.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yes, certainly. I mean, you've just launched Uncommon Ground. Is that correct? You want to tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah. So many people will know me from having hosted dialogues between Christians and non-Christians for many years on The Unbelievable Show, as you mentioned, on Premier Christian Radio, which became a quite a well-known podcast and video show in due course. Well, I finished up hosting that show nearly 3 years ago now, believe it or not, to move on to other things, more of a freelance sort of ministry. But the very latest thing that we've been doing through my production company, Think Faith, is working on, and we've just launched, Uncommon Ground, which is effectively bringing me back into that sweet spot of moderating Christian, non-Christian dialogues and debates. It's filmed in a beautiful venue, Yarnton Manor in Oxford, which is a lovely old 16th century manor house.
Wow.
And it's all done in... beats this as well, but it's it's a beautiful kind of setting for it, for these long form conversations. So yeah, we just launched just literally as I'm speaking last night. We put up our first episode, which is Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, opposite Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. So they're talking God, science, what best explains the poetry of reality. But we've got some fantastic episodes coming up with people like Alex O'Connor, who's quite well-known YouTube atheist, opposite Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life, debating the kind of Tom Holland Dominion thesis, basically. Did Christianity give us morality? People like Stephen C. Meyer, who's a sort of intelligent design proponent, opposite an atheist scientist. We've got, loads more really interesting conversations coming up on this new show, Uncommon Ground. So if you enjoy that kind of thing, do check out my YouTube channel, Justin Brierley, and do make sure to subscribe. Or if you prefer audio podcast, you can find it just as Uncommon Ground with Justin Brierley.
That sounds great. I will be tuning in and listening to those debates. They often feed me with thoughts and arguments that I end up using in my own evangelism. I remember doing that from your time on Christian Premier Radio with unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, maybe good to get you in for the next season that we do, Bob. You know.
Yeah, I'd certainly be open to that if you wanted to have me on. So let's get into it, because for me at least, and I suspect for a lot of other people, it is you that has sounded the klaxon about this this new movement of the Spirit in our country and in the English-speaking world. It was certainly you that put it on my radar, and it was your work that impressed upon me the idea that we're kind of living in a moment of opportunity that we should really seize on in terms of evangelism. What was it that raised your awareness of it? Why did you think it important enough to organize a day conference? You know, what was it that drew you to the knowledge and promotion of this quiet revival?
Well, when I began talking about this phrase "quiet revival" didn't exist. That kind of came later and was a very interesting kind of almost confirmation of what I think I'd been starting to see several years earlier, actually. So yeah, just to give you a bit of a background sketch, you know, I've been hosting conversations on faith for the best part of 2 decades now, and so I started in the mid 2000s with this show Unbelievable, and it was very much the heyday of the new atheist era in the mid 2000s. You know, these best-selling anti-God books from Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and so on, the so-called 4 horsemen of the new atheism. You might even remember the London bus campaign, you know, the atheist bus campaign saying there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So all of that was the kind of the tenor of the conversation. You know, these were very bombastic, you know, anti-God kind of secular public intellectuals. And it was kind of, you know, Christianity was very much being painted as ridiculous, fairy tales, dismissed. People were just making fun of it. Now, it was a fun and interesting time to start a faith debate show, because there were some really flamboyant characters and big issues you could get your teeth into, and had a great fun, you know, in the following 20 years, you know, hosting these conversations between atheists and Christian thinkers. But I did notice the conversation start to change, especially towards the end of my time on the Unbelievable show. So this would have been the late 2010s. And by that point, there'd been all kinds of ructions and issues and fallings out within the atheist community itself that led to this new atheist movement kind of going out, you know, waning just almost as quickly as it had risen up. But I just noticed that in place of these new atheist types like Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens were a set of new thinkers, often still secular, not necessarily Christian, but with a very different kind of attitude towards Christian faith, offering very different answers, but drawing a very similar demographic, you know, often young men, you know, coming along to their lectures and things. So the obvious one example is Jordan Peterson, well-known sort of Canadian psychologist who kind of rose to fame around 2017, 2018. And I happened to have him on my show in 2018, doing a conversation on whether we can make sense of life without God, opposite an atheist psychologist, Susan Blackmore. And it was one of those interesting ones because he himself, you know, I wouldn't have said was a Christian either, but he kind of came on almost defending Christian values, the Christian worldview to some extent, you know, saying we definitely need something like God to have a grasp on anything like human dignity or value and that kind of thing. And obviously he went on to become this massively popular speaker and thinker, who was sort of critiquing the atheistic perspective and pointing people back, interestingly, towards the Bible as a source of morality and meaning and purpose and identity. And I just witnessed so many, wherever Peterson stood on the faith spectrum, so many people, especially young men, who just seemed to be willing to take Christian faith seriously again because he'd kind of given them intellectual permission to do so. And so I was just noticing this sort of from the sidelines, thinking this is a really interesting phenomenon. This is very different to what was happening before. And then, you know, other characters started popping up on the scene. The historian Tom Holland, for instance, you know, did several shows with him, again, with a very different take, you know, to the kind of typical new atheist sort of what has Christianity ever done for us kind of view. In fact, in his, you know, best-selling book Dominion, saying actually pretty much everything we think about morality and civilization really harks back to Christian faith. And I think doing a very good job of making that case. And so I was sort of bumping into these thinkers. Anyway, long story short, come sort of around 2020, 2021, I thought, you know what? I think I'm bumping into enough people who are both coming to faith and as, you know, grown adults thinking people, and these sort of secular thinkers who are on the fringes of faith and certainly talking in very different terms about faith, to say that something's happening. It feels like there's been a shift. And so I started writing a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And it really was just my kind of finger in the air, kind of very much based on my anecdotal experience of the fact that these conversations seem to be shifting. No data really to back it up, if I'm absolutely honest. In fact, the only data I quoted in the book was, you know, all the stuff showing a decline in Christian faith in the West, decreasing religiosity, church going in decline, and so on. But I wanted to say in this book, but I feel like something's changing in the atmosphere. And the central metaphor I use is quite a well-worn one. You know, that idea of the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith.
Yeah.
Famous sort of quote from Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach. And I guess I just said, well, what if the sea of faith could come back in? What if we're perhaps just living in a moment when there's a sort of turning of the tide, and the secular story that's been so rampant in the West is kind of failing to deliver on its promises? There's a kind of, and one of the big themes of the book is that we're kind of living through a meaning crisis, and people can only live without meaning for so long before they go looking for it again. And that's what I think we're seeing.
What is it that you know, what do you think that is, because then obviously you've got the report that was released by the Bible Society, which is comparing two sets of data, I think separated by about 5 years, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
One data set was about 18,000. One data set was maybe 13 or 11,000.
13, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and it showed a dramatic increase in you know, people attending church, particularly young men, which is very interesting. Yeah, and I was wondering, you know, what I know what the report says, and I'm vaguely familiar with what the report says, but as well as the report, what do you think, and feel free to include the report if you just wholesale agree with it, what do you think is leading to this sort of return to God, this quiet revival in the churches?
Well, the quiet revival itself was this report published by the Bible Society just under a year ago. It came out just before Easter 2025. And they kind of gave me an early heads up on it, actually, a month or two ahead of them releasing it. And it was quite stunning in some ways, because, as you say, it was a very credible, wide-ranging, you know, big data set report that was essentially a repeat of this survey they'd done in 2018. 6 years later, 2024, they'd done basically exactly the same survey, asking the same questions, but radically different results. And so one of the interesting aspects of this was, overall, people were saying they were attending church more. But the most, you know, acute growth, if you like, was among the youngest age group, the 18 to 24 bracket, which in 2018, around 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds had said they went to church around once a month. That had leapt up to 16% in 2024. And so, you know, a quadrupling on the face of it. Even more among young men. If you just sort of account for young men, that had gone up to 21%. So, you know, 5 times the number. And so this was pretty stunning. But it did kind of confirm what I had, as I said, been hearing about a lot. So once I'd published the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, lots of things started happening in the kind of 2 years following that, basically. I just started to hear more and more pastors, church leaders saying, we're seeing something like what you've described in your book, Justin, just this openness to faith, people walking off the street, especially young people, especially young men, often just coming clutching a Bible because they've kind of been run into an influencer online who's told them about Christian faith or whatever. So yeah, so I was like, wow, this could be, you know, because one of the critiques I had, you know, from the outset, from the book and the podcast series that I launched on the back of it was, well, all the data suggests Christianity still in permanent decline, Justin. So this felt like, potentially a huge, interesting confirmation, very early confirmation that something really was changing. So that was, and so there were other measures, that the Bible Society were also reflecting on religiosity, how much people kind of read the Bible, that kind of thing. And again, on all these measures, there seemed to be increased engagement and so on. Now, interestingly, not all of the age groups were on the rise. That in the middle kind of age groups, the sort of millennials, Gen Xers, there was actually a bit of a dip, actually. But on both ends, at the older end and at the younger end, there was this increase. And so, yeah, I was fascinated by that. Did my own interview with Rhiannon McAleer, one of the authors of the report, and certainly have talked about it a lot in relation to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, because it did feel like a really interesting confirmation of that. Now, the question, what leads to this? Well, you see, I would say the bigger picture of what's behind this is what I describe in my book and podcast series, this meaning crisis. I think a lot of people, and I think this is especially acute in my view among the younger generation, are experiencing a complete lack of meaning, purpose, or identity in their life. And one of the ways I talk about it is the idea that we're kind of made to live within a story. The problem is the story that once gave shape to the vast majority of people's lives, whether they sort of realized it or not, was the Christian story. But as that Christian story has sort of been sidelined for the last 150 years or more in the West, it hasn't opened up this kind of space for a scientific utopia that the new atheist thought would replace religion. That's a non-story. It's not a story people can really live their lives by, because it doesn't give you purpose or meaning or anything. So people have, I think, been grabbing onto all kinds of other stories for a long time. And all the usual characters there, money, success, power, wealth, relationship, sex. But increasingly in our digital age, there's been a kind of multiplication of stories, because there are so many options on the table now for young people, and you can basically create your own identity. There's 100,000 different gender and sexuality preferences. All of that, I think, has created kind of a proliferation of potential stories, and people are trying to put these stories, whether they're kind of on the progressive left or on the political right, stories that they hope will make sense of their life, kind of fill that sacred God-shaped hole, but none of them, of course, do. In fact, they all clash up against each other, create these toxic culture wars. And I just think that's led to a kind of intensification, especially, as I say, among the youngest generation, of a kind of sense of nihilism, despair. It's led to a mental health crisis. We know that from the statistics. And all of these, I think, are part of a wider picture that prepares the ground for people just to be so desperate, they're willing to go back and look at the original story again. And that's why I think you've had people like Peterson having such an outsized influence on his young audience, saying, I know you guys are desperate for meaning and purpose and identity. Go and look at this book that actually gave us the foundations for that. So I think that's the bigger picture, if you will. And then I think there's some particular other things that play into it as well. But that's the kind of the general atmosphere that I think has laid the ground for this so-called quiet revival.
Yeah, I mean, when I attended the day conference that you held, and I'll say it again, I hope you're going to hold more of these day conferences, because I think that we're in a moment of opportunity, and we really need to be galvanizing, because I think this quiet revival will be counted in months, not years. And so my gut impression, and I am speaking just from the gut here, is that we're being given a chance by a certain generation, and there's a new interest in meaning within our generation, and we've really got to step into the fray. I think some of the triggers, the triggers for it myself, in my own experience of evangelizing, and I say this without boast, but just as mere fact, evangelizing thousands of people and talking to thousands of people, is that where we've people, there's a lot of movement in the political right, a lot of openness within the political right to the Christian faith, and that's been caused by three things. It's been caused by progressive overreach. So a lot of people were very horrified when transgender politics started going after children in schools. And there were videos of transgender men dancing erotically in front of children and encouraging children to dance erotically in front of audiences as well. That really shocked a lot of people into asking questions. Seeing Islamists supporting marchers on our street, supporting Hamas, really shocked a lot of people. And then also the lockdown and the fact that lots of people resented the lockdown. And all of a sudden, in the lockdown, they suddenly had to confront questions of meaning because all their distractions were taken away from them. And I think as that's created a reaction, particularly on the right, where not only has the right grown, the political or the cultural right has grown in reaction to these things that I've just mentioned, but then as it's grown, they've tried to find a grounding for their politics. And as they've followed the tributaries down through, sort of like culturally conservative values, at each layer as they go down into finding the foundation, the grounding, they keep encountering Christianity all the way down. And I think that is one of the reasons that I'm seeing huge numbers of men coming in with broadly right-wing views, seeking faith and seeking Christ and discovering Christianity and wanting to know which Bible to read and which church to go to, and I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
I think you've put your finger on a lot of it there, Bob. And absolutely, I think there's definitely the political vibe shift is all bound up to a large degree with a lot of what we're seeing happening culturally speaking. So this features less in the book, which kind of was a snapshot, 2.5 years ago now of where things lay. There's a lot that's happened in the last 2.5 years. But in the podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I've been tracking all this kind of in real time, really. And so the last season, the past year, has featured a lot of kind of looking at this whole aspect of how does Islam feature in this, the right-wing shift and everything else. And I think it's a really interesting moment. And I think you're right. I encounter a lot of young men myself who definitely have been turned off by the very progressive culture. To some extent, their interest in faith, in Christianity, in church is to some extent a reaction against that. It's looking for something that feels more traditional, deeper, stronger, that's got, embedded in it, in a sense, a more conservative way of looking at life, family, values, and so on. There's been a really interesting shift, and so interesting in a sense that the demographic that arguably has been missing in so many churches, young men, seems to be at the forefront of this interest and this coming back. And then, and I'm sure you've heard of this as well, and some of your viewers, that within that Quiet Revival research, and what I was also hearing anecdotally as I researched the book and the podcast series, a lot of those young men are being attracted to more traditional forms of Christianity. So it tends to, the surge really has been sort of mainly concentrated in more Catholic or Anglo-Catholic or Eastern Orthodox kind of set places. That's been a lot of where the energy has been, and to some extent also in kind of more charismatic Pentecostal kind of forms of Christian faith. It's the kind of middle of the road sort of churches that are probably seeing the least kind of impact from the Quiet Revival, interestingly. And one aspect of that is that, there's a lot of, these people who are kind of on a journey, interested in and seeking so on, have told me, we don't find very attractive a version of Christianity or church which is just kind of already repeating what's on offer in the secular culture, just the same platitudes and humanistic phrases and whatever. And that came through, especially I think during the pandemic. Tom Holland, interestingly, the historian, who's sort of himself, when he does go to church, attends a very sort of high Anglo-Catholic church in London. One of his main complaints was that he just felt the Church of England wasn't doing what it should do in the pandemic, which is to be a kind of spiritual leadership for people. He felt it was just aping the same kind of, wash your hands and wear a mask kind of advice. And so he felt like quite disappointed. That's not what the church is there for. That's not why I go to church. If we, and I think that that you know, a lot of young people are looking for something that feels quite different, feels weird, you could say. You know, it's one of Tom Holland's phrases is, you know, if you want to attract people, keep Christianity weird. Basically, it's got to feel different to what's already on offer. Otherwise, it just becomes kind of church just becomes invisible if it's just another version of what can already be, you know, you've already got on offer in culture. So I think all of that plays into it, you know, and I do get the sense that you know, that doesn't come without challenges. Obviously, the more conservative right wing kind of aspect of what there is there. And I'd also say, I'd want to kind of also say, I think there is a spiritual search going on among people who might consider themselves more left wing or progressive or whatever. It's just that those searches aren't as naturally bring them to Christianities. But if you go onto a space like TikTok, you know, you have got young people, often, you know, more on the female side, you know, super interested in tarot, witchcraft, crystals, manifesting. You know, their search is on. None of them are atheists, is what I'm saying. They're kind of like they're much less likely to be atheist young people than their parents or grandparents. But it's the young men who seem to be gravitating more towards Christian faith as a kind of a solution.
Yeah. When I was a religious study student a long time ago, a very long time ago, sadly, the academics knew 20 years ago that that a decrease in Christianity did not mean a decrease in metaphysical belief or in spirituality. It was just a shift from Christianity to essentially more religions of the self. And I think what we're seeing now is a somewhat gender divided rejection of that religion of self back to religions of authority, you know, as in authorities outside of the self, or hard religions, you know, as we would use in the academic scene. And I think what's really interesting for me from the research is the fact that you know, at face value, you know, Pentecostal churches and Roman Catholic churches and Orthodox churches couldn't look or sound more different. And yet those are the two groups that are benefiting most. And by contrast, Anglo-Catholics, certainly to my experience, and perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps you are aware of facts that I'm not aware of, but Anglo-Catholics aren't particularly benefiting as much as Roman Catholics or Orthodox Coptic churches and charismatics. And I think that the thing that these two expressions of Christianity have in common is that they are not shy about placing expectations upon the believer. You know, like in lots of Pentecostal churches, evangelism is expected. You're going to participate in evangelism. You're going to participate in speaking in tongues. You will pay your tithe. You know, it is important to study the Bible, to come to the prayer meeting. In Orthodox Catholic circles, it's like you will go to confession, do your penance, you are going to come to the mass. They're not shy about having a bar that you should raise yourself up to. Whereas in lots of Church of England churches, and even in lots of really good evangelical churches, it's within evangelical churches, it's more about, well, you know, do you have the right intellectual assent? Can you tick the right premises of the 4-point presentation that I've got to make to you about who Jesus is? And in lots of Church of England churches, it's just come as you are. Jesus loves you just as you are. You don't need to change, you know. And I think that is telling us something about what kind of spirituality is feeding people, and where the church should have always been, but where the church needs to be in terms of its outreach.
Yeah, no, I think again, there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, it's interesting with the Anglo-Catholic thing. I do know of Anglo-Catholic churches that have definitely seen a real increase. I mean, one prominent example is great St. Bartholomew the Great in central London, which is the church where Tom Holland tends to attend when he can. But very Anglo-Catholic, oldest church in London, effectively over 900 years old, and yeah, just bursting at the seams. Now, interestingly, I would say the clientele, if you like, are on the more conservative end of the spectrum. You know, it tends to be the church that, you know, editors of The Spectator go to, and you know, that kind of thing. And likewise, though, I've heard of other Anglo-Catholic churches who are also, because of what they offer specifically, it's the aesthetic of the worship as much as anything. It feels different. It's mysterious. It's otherworldly, and it appeals at that level. Now, it may not ask as much, actually, in terms of the actual practices of the laity and so on. And that may be where I think the average Anglo-Catholic church is probably falling behind. And I think there's a lot to do as well with just the fact that, on average, a lot of those Anglo-Catholic churches in the Church of England tend to be more rural. The inner city churches tend to be of the more evangelical, charismatic variety. And rural churches just are struggling in general because of the dynamics of, you know, what's happened over the last 100 years, really. So there's that, you know, but no, I agree with your general point, which is it's the churches that are actually asking something of the congregants that are actually flourishing. And I think you're absolutely right. I think people want to be challenged. I think young men, especially, you know, this group that we've been talking about, it's because they've been so rudderless for so long. They haven't been given anything to kind of hold on to. You know, they often say, don't they, that, you know, for young kind of men, you know, drifting around without any purpose, you know, sometimes a spell in the army does them the world of good, because it gives them a kind of a sense of focus and structure and whatever. And I think that's kind of what most young men are looking for: structure, something that will give their life a kind of guiding, you know, principle. And so many of them now, sadly, are just lost in a sea of often pornography addiction, kind of, you know, endless YouTube or social media. They don't feel, you know, their life hasn't really launched for all kinds of reasons. And suddenly, you know, if someone comes along and says, look, I've got something here that could just help you to get going in life, and actually is something that's much deeper, stronger than the twaddle you're hearing, you know, in the circles that, you know, you normally move in, I think it's very enticing. I mean, interestingly, on the flip side, it's also why, to some, Islam has become quite attractive. You know, it offers a very kind of robust, kind of strong, you know, identity, and you can see why a certain number of young men are attracted to Islam. So it's kind of, it's not that we're saying it just because it offers that it's true, but certainly that's part of the attraction, you know, of what's going on.
Oh yeah, I would say, I mean, obviously I am biased here completely, but I would say that intellectually, you know, the representatives of Islam have been receiving L's all over the place, and intellectually Islam is busted up. All of its strong points have been broken up, and it's withering under criticism. But what the mosque does better than the church is instilling a clear sense of identity of, we are Muslims, whereas lots of Christians, they kind of receive a, are we Christian? We should be Christian. It's kind of a very different tone of identity. And we need to be much more robust in saying we are Christians, we are proud of our Christianity, this is our identity. But then the other thing that mosques do better than churches is brotherhood. You know, Muslims will stand with Muslims through thick and thin, whereas Christians are not so coherent in standing with their fellow Christians. And that kind of sense of brotherhood and belonging and strong identity speaks to a lot of people who, you know, do not go through life with degrees, thinking about everything academically. You know, they are spoken to by other mediums. And I think that the church really needs to rediscover the fact that, you know, the Bible is replete with the command of stand firm in the faith. You know, be strong. Like it's one of the most often repeated commands of the entire scripture. Don't be afraid, be strong, stand firm in the faith, hold fast. It just goes on and on and on. But also the Bible has very clear teachings around brotherhood that we're not really discipling people around, about this idea of the unity of the body and about Christian solidarity amongst Christians.
Yeah, and I did two episodes actually of my Surprising Rebirth podcast documentary series specifically on this issue of the kind of male identity crisis and these young men looking for purpose and meaning. And there were some really helpful kind of people I spoke to about this. John Tyson, you may be familiar with, but a kind of pastor out in New York who does a great kind of, has done some brilliant resources that he just sensed were lacking in today's world for young men who we no longer really have rites of passage for young men in so many ways. And that's partly to do with the fact that sadly so many young men don't even grow up with a father figure anyway in their life today. But there's a sense in which the things that cultures kind of always did to kind of initiate men from children eventually into to young men doesn't exist. And so I think there's a place for the church to do that. I think the church can be an incredible place for male mentors, for young men who are often lacking them in their life, and where you can kind of build, a real sense of that community, that brotherhood that you're talking about. I mean, I will just say, that's not to say that it has to be some kind of chest beating alpha male, we're gonna go on those, what are those big sort of cars with huge wheels, in the thing. It's kind of like there's a kind of slightly hackneyed version of masculinity that I sometimes see represented. And in reality, is men come in all shapes and sizes. But in general, most men I meet, there's some commonalities. I've been working in the world of apologetics for 20 years now. It's 95% of the people who are most engaged with apologetics are men. It's just the way men are wired for whatever reason. That intellectual side of Christian faith just really appeals often more to the male mind than the female mind. That's just the fact of it. And so I think one of the things that church can do is really help to offer that, a kind of really intellectually coherent version of Christianity can be hugely helpful to a lot of men. It's not the only thing. But I
would agree. I would agree with you absolutely. But I would say, I come from a working class community. I evangelize a lot of working class people, a lot of working class lads. Will have different levels of self-awareness to how much they don't know.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily intellectualize their life in the way that the apologists that you've hung around with for the last 20 years would. And actually what speaks to them is brotherhood in the face of adversity, brotherhood in the face of opposition.
Yeah.
And I think that is not something that the church should be frightened of. It shouldn't be frightened of saying that the church has enemies and that the men of the church have a responsibility to defend the church against those enemies. You only have to look at what's happening across the Islamic world or in Burma, or in North Korea to recognize that the church has real enemies, or even in America where you've got, white supremacists who attack churches or progressives who storm and interrupt church services. And so since I would say that since we shouldn't be frightened of conflict and we shouldn't be frightened of recognizing the church has enemies, it's actually better for us to cultivate men's energies to be directed against the enemies of the church, but then to give them a code of chivalry. I don't know if you're aware of C.S. Lewis's writings on chivalry and the need for chivalry, that it was a work of art created by the church to turn brutish warriors into gentle men. Well, right now, the church has the opposite problem. We have lots of very gentle men who need to learn a bit more about what it is to be a warrior. And chivalry actually is the code that we could tap into. It's a completely Christian invention, and use that to instill a manhood in men.
Yeah, and I think there's absolutely a place for that. And I think to some extent the pendulum has swung too far, as you say. And the reality is that there is a huge problem across the church in the UK of it being very middle class, quite, highly educated, and just not speaking to the needs, I think, of a lot of many parts. And that's why you have seen, I think, someone like a Tommy Robinson, very controversial character, obviously, kind of bringing sort of so many people hearkening to his message, because he's basically got the gift of actually communicating very often simply to working class people. And, his recent turn towards Christian faith means that suddenly people are kind of, now that's a whole other conversation we could have, and we may well do. But I do see that there's a problem here with the church, that we have fallen, unfortunately, into kind of silos that sadly mean that we think we're reaching people, but we're only reaching people like us, and it's a great shame. I do think I think on the counter flip side though, we also need to be careful, as I said, of kind of a very sort of simplistic version of masculinity, when masculinity can be quite varied. I'm not into football, I don't kind of.
Me neither. I'm a rugby guy.
Yeah. Well, I'm not into sports generally. That's the problem. So all of that stuff goes over my head. There's lots of aspects in which I'm not a particularly, typically quote unquote masculine guy, but I'm still a guy. And there's a sense in which I need Christianity to speak to me. Now, for me, that has been, the intellectual side of that has been an important part of it, but it's going to be different for other men. But the other part of it is, Jesus, has to be our ultimate guide, obviously, to what it is to be a truly human person and the best example of a man that there possibly ever has been.
Amen.
And, Jesus was an unmarried man. He never had sex in his life. He did not respond to those who beat him. He did not respond with power, in terms of aggression. The kind of power he wielded was a very different kind of power. So all of that has to kind of figure as well in the way in which we encourage men to model themselves after Christ. He is a very countercultural kind of example of masculinity. This is not your Andrew Tate kind of masculinity when it comes to Christ. So I just think that's really important to be aware of, because I would say if we're just kind of trying to create a kind of Christian version of the Islamic kind of masculinity, I think that's not going to be good, because obviously what Christ represents is quite different in terms of.
Yeah, I think I agree. We've got to define masculinity in Christian terms, and I believe that is what the Code of Chivalry is. The Code of Chivalry is exactly that, and it was in a time far more brutal than ours, and it worked to create a gentle, that's why we talk about chivalry as, oh, you're a gentleman, you're chivalrous, that's precisely because of the influence of chivalry. And I think that it's a great resource for Christians to be tapped into. Now, forgive me, Justin, I'm going to park that very interesting conversation there. And what I'm going to do is temporarily for the next hour, I'm going to install you as both Pope, lead pastor of all Protestants, and patriarch of all Orthodox churches.
Oh dear.
And I'm going to ask if you could wave a magic wand and direct the churches, either as denominations, congregations, and you can adjust your answers as you wish, and individual Christians. What would you be having Christians do right now? Like, if you could put down a plan for the next 2 years and in as much detail as you want, if you could dictate to people, you're going to do this exact kind of evangelism, or I want you to follow this strategy, or I want you to emphasize this, or I want you to, put these kinds of services on, whatever you want, blue sky thinking. And no one could argue with you. What would you have Christians do right now to harvest this quiet revival?
So what I'm going to suggest is not rocket science. Actually, it's kind of quite simple, but I think it's what's needed at the moment, and something that a lot of churches I think have forgotten, because we've got so kind of seeker sensitive very often in our evangelism that we've missed the fact that actually right now I think people, especially these young people we're talking about, are looking for something quite simple, quite basic. Actually, firstly, I think people are ready to be asked to church. I think Christians right now need to just be asking people to come along to church with them. And you might be surprised at just how open people are. Just had some really interesting research through from Fusion, who are a kind of Christian organization that runs across campuses across the UK, and just huge levels of openness that they've found in their research of young people who would say yes if a friend asked them to go to church. So just kind of be just for confidence in inviting people along and telling the Christian story, like being upfront about what you believe and why. On top of that, like, give people the Bible. I was at a student mission last week, and one of the leaders of the mission was saying, it's interesting because we've often sort of give out like Book of John or something, and it's kind of packaged to not look like a Bible. Well, actually, students are actually asking us for a Bible, something that looks like a Bible. They want the Bible. And so we're actually just giving away Bibles now, and they're going like hotcakes. And I just think there's a real interest in people have realized this. A lot of people at least have realized this book is really important. And we're losing something as we lose this book. So just give people the Bible, honestly. Go and buy a stack of Bibles and give them to people who you think might be interested in getting hold of it. And just obviously turn up, make sure you're there for the conversations when they have them. So invite people to church, buy them the Bible, and let's just be really confident in telling the Christian story, like not apologizing for it. I think there's a sort of sense in which people are ready to hear it again in that kind of way. And then when they are in church, I'd say, let's actually, like, again, not pull our punches, be quite direct. I don't think young people are actually that interested anymore in being entertained in church, to some extent. I mean, it's not that we can put on a good show and everything, but if it's just a good show, I think we're shortchanging people at this point, because actually they've got more entertainment than you could shake a stick at in their pocket on their phone. They don't need more entertainment. I think a lot of them are coming to church because they're looking for something real, something like some bedrock. So teach the Bible and do it like properly, don't water it down. And I think you'll be surprised at how many people, even though it might kind of, you might think, oh, that's off-putting, we need to kind of soft pedal it, for beginners and so on. I think there's a kind of a real interest, especially, as I say, among these young men, to kind of really get to grips with it. And even if it's a bit difficult to get their head around, that in a funny way is a kind of an attraction right now. They don't necessarily have to understand it all from the outset. Just go straight in, start teaching from the Bible. And likewise, if you're kind of a youth minister, if you're leading a youth group, I think get into the Bible. Don't spend too much time, playing the games and whatnot. My experience of that has been young people actually want to just get into talking about the Bible and the big stuff. So I'd say it's not rocket science in that way. The other thing that, I'm just convinced is more and more important for churches is that they are these places where they're fast becoming one of the few places where people can get regular human community. And I don't know if you heard this when, very famous convert Ayaan Hirsi Ali became a Christian and was in some ways a extraordinary example of kind of in one person's life what my book thesis was all about, this kind of rise and fall of new atheism and this new conversation on God. And Ayaan's sort of journey to faith sort of very much mirrored that whole conversation. But one of the things she said, apart from, her own experience of praying and going to church and how this sort of turned her life upside down, and was just, she said very simple things like the fact people gather afterwards over a coffee and talk. She said that was quite an eye-opener to her. She hadn't really seen that happen, certainly not in her Muslim background, and she didn't realize this sort of happened in church. And it's such a simple thing that we take for granted, but it's actually the thing that's often missing now. People can live their lives almost completely independent of other human beings a lot of the time. I don't think we realize just how many lonely people there are out there.
Yeah, if you go to any Orthodox church, they after every mass, which is 2 hours long, and unapologetically in a language that most people don't understand, they will then sit and have a big meal together.
Yeah, absolutely.
You go to Kensington Temple, which has got somewhere between 2,000 to 8,000 members. After every church service, there's usually a meal together, and so I think building strong community is a massive part of this. Strong, but it's got to be strong Christian community.
Absolutely, yeah. It can't just be a social club, as as I say, people can get that anywhere. It really is it's when we gather around Christ that it makes the difference. And so I'm again, none of these are like very terribly kind of grand evangelistic strategies. It's just giving people permission to do kind of what is the bread and butter of it, because I think sometimes we can come up with all the amazing evangelistic strategies in the world, but I think it's only when people are kind of ready to hear that suddenly things start to happen. And I just think we're in one of those moments where as Jesus said, the fields are white unto harvest. There's a sort of sense in which the harvest time has arrived. Now, who knows how long it's going to last? You said maybe it's just a matter of months. It might be. But it does feel like there's a kind of openness for people to hear. So let's do it. Let's make the most of this moment and invite people, give them Bibles, tell them the Christian story.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow. You mentioned things like, ask people to come to church, be confident in telling the Christian story, give people the Bible, be unashamed in your sort of Christianity. Don't go for entertainment, just do Christianity without leaning into entertainment culture. You talk with people directly about what Christianity is, have strong community, which I might come back to. But is there anything else you wanted to add to that list? Because I interrupted your flow of thought. So,
well, only that piece about keep Christianity weird as well. There's a sense in which, and I was kind of intimating it with the Bible stuff, it's okay for people not to kind of immediately grasp everything. There's something actually quite attractive about feeling like there's more here that I need to get to grips with and understand. And likewise, I would say, because of different church styles of church are so different from your Catholics to your Kensington temples, it's about leaning into the thing that makes your Christian expression unique. So if you are a Pentecostal charismatic church, I think be quite unashamed and unapologetic about that, because I think that is actually something that people will find fascinating and attractive right now. It's not actually going to be off-putting to people. Likewise, if you're of a more Catholic variety of church, that is partly what is drawing people. It's the mystery of that. And so I would say, don't apologize for that. Let's be comfortable in our own skin. And I think, generally, it's what you described earlier. It's that actually raising the bar rather than lowering it. I think there's something about saying, actually, this is going to cost you. This isn't just a kind of pick and mix, everything's optional kind of faith. There's a kind of expectation here. And, by and large, we know that the churches that have tended to still manage to survive and thrive through a long period of secularism are the churches that have kind of raised the bar. The ones that have basically lowered the bar, as Tom Holland says, they kind of become invisible. It's like, well, I can get that already. If this doesn't require anything of me going to this church, well, why am I bothering turning up in the first place? It's I think there's a sense in which young people especially are looking for the challenge of Christian faith.
And I think during the lockdown, a lot of people that were going to what I would call civic religion churches, i.e. churches that just see themselves as the keepers of the civic calendar, come for us for your baptisms, your weddings, your funerals, and on the 11th of the 11th, and for other days of national mourning, like when the Queen dies. These civic kind of religion churches. After lockdown, a lot of those churches saw massive falls in their attendance as people just went, I could do other things with my Sunday. I want some of the things, because when I went to your conference, I was chomping at the bit in the hope that certain things were going to be pressed forward, and they didn't. And I actually think that in this moment of opportunity, any church that can afford to employ a full-time evangelist should employ a full-time evangelist, because and I'm not just saying that for self-serving reasons, because I am a full-time evangelist. I'm not looking for a job. I'm just saying, because lots of churches will pay good money for someone to lead the worship, even though that's not a biblical category. It's not a biblical office. They'll pay for someone to do youth work, and that's not a biblical office either. But an evangelist is a biblical office. And in my experience, every full-time evangelist bears witness. Every full-time evangelist that I've ever met and asked them, how's it going? They all bear witness to the fact that they are bringing people to the faith, even if they're not on social media, if they're just doing it the old-fashioned ways and they're not famous at all. In my experience, they're bringing more people to Christ than your average Christian. So imagine if every church that could afford to have an evangelist did have an evangelist. the Church of England, for instance, is about to spend about £720,000 pushing that from the pulpit they should preach against racism. Now, churches should be doing that anyway. They don't need £720,000 to do something that's clearly in Scripture. It's just you exegete the relevant passages as you come across them. But I did the calculations. If you paid evangelists 30k each, they could employ for a year, I think it was 22 evangelists for a year, or for 720k, which could be used as a group to go around different cities. So my point is, if churches really want to do evangelism, they should be willing to put their resources into having full-time evangelists. And
I think it's a great idea. And like you say, I think now there's never been a better moment, as it were, to do that work of evangelism. And I think it's interesting because in my experience, you know, I think there are just a lot of people now who are kind of on the edges of church, ready to listen, ready to hear. And they just need that person who can come alongside them and encourage them and give them the gospel message. And I think there's a huge harvest potentially to be had. I mean, obviously, the classic response to this is, well, aren't we all supposed to be evangelists? You know, do we need to? You know, now of course that's true. You know, just we don't want to leave it all to one person who's been specially assigned to it. And my hope is that churches equally are going to be, you know, this is the moment to be encouraging the people in the pews and the congregation to really flex their evangelistic muscles and realize this is a unique opportunity to start having these conversations and so on. But yeah, absolutely. I think it will be a wonderful use of resources to actually do evangelism through specific ministries in the church. And so much of kind of what's happening actually even within those kind of church ministries that often exist are full of evangelistic opportunity right now as well, I think. You know, when if you've got a group that kind of is aimed towards young people or men or whatever, I just think you can be evangelizing within those contexts really, you know, in ways that, you know, it's not so many people that I'm meeting certainly who are interested in coming along to church or have started to become engaged. They're not there yet, but they need evangelists within the church who are there to basically explain the faith to them and kind of take them across the line and on that journey, you know.
And I've got another point that I want to bring out, but I think that an evangelist, part of the role of any full-time evangelist would be to cultivate the culture of evangelism amongst other Christians and empower members of the congregation and encourage members of the congregation to be doing evangelism, not just doing the evangelism themselves. But the other thing that I think is important, because I remember from your day conference that one of the speakers who was speaking about the report, I think it was the lady that you interviewed,
Rhiannon Macklin.
She mentioned something about, you know, there was a kind of, people were sincerely engaging with the Bible, but there was a sensitivity about it. Like, so for instance, you know, they were finding it challenging to read Old Testament passages where it appears that God has commanded for the wholesale destruction of nations, you know, everything down to the cow and the calf in the street. And I think that right now is not just the rebirth, a surprising rebirth in the belief in God, but it's also the rebirth of the apologist and the age of the apologist in a new way, in a way that we haven't really seen since Roman times. Apologists are taking center stage within this evangelism within the Christian world, and it's important for apologetics to be taught in our churches, because so many times I'm coming across people who've abandoned the faith because they've got tripped up on a very simple question, and then they went to the priest or they went to the vicar or they went to the pastor, and what they got was fluff. What they got was a wet answer, you know, that was paper thin, that even they could see through. And it's like, you really don't know how to engage with a question I've just asked you. And I think it raises the need for more apologetics. And what are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely. And to some extent, I tend not to separate them too much, evangelism and apologetics. Obviously, there is a distinction, but most people I meet, if you're evangelizing to them, you're also at some level doing apologetics with them, because inevitably, you know, there are going to be questions along the way. And yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And I think this is a moment when we do need those kinds of apologetics, especially around scripture, because it's still just as easy to run into in an internet age, you know, lots of objections to faith. As soon as you start to get interested in faith and you type in, you know, Christian, Bible, whatever online, you're probably going to run into kind of anti-theistic kind of stuff, as well as, you know, the stuff that is engaging positively. So I think it's really important that we have boots on the ground, as it were, who are ready to engage those kinds of questions in person in our churches. But there has been this extraordinary flourishing, actually, of online apologetics ministries. You're a great example, Bob, you know, both what you do online, but what you do in person, you know, down at Speaker's Corner and elsewhere. And so I'm kind of very encouraged, actually, that in a funny way, that new atheist era of 20 years ago kind of created the conditions for all kinds of, I think, very important apologetics ministries to flourish. And so I'm really glad that actually there is an awful lot out there now for people to go. So even if they get a pretty wet, paper thin answer, sadly, from their local minister, there's actually some pretty good stuff that's not that far away. The problem is sometimes curating it. There's obviously a lot of dross alongside the good that you'll bump into on social media and everywhere else. But I'm, you know, the good thing is, you know, as for all the problems the internet has brought us, it's also means that you can send people good material, good links, good answers to questions at the drop of a hat. And so it's interesting, you know, I started some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, just after lockdown, just doing simple apologetics thoughts on my TikTok channel. And like the third one I did kind of went viral, and got like 6 million views. And it just, I'd never realized it, but this was just a huge evangelistic opportunity, because I was just flooded with messages, especially from young people saying, I'm really interested in faith, or I've got this question. Interestingly, lots of Muslims also got in touch with me saying, love your stuff, Justin, you should be a Muslim. And that's when I realized, my goodness, there are more Muslim evangelists here on TikTok than are Christians. And you know, this is where we need to be as Christians. We need to be in this space, you know, making sure that the Christian worldview is represented. I think that's got a lot better in the last few years. We've got some amazing people doing great work, but yeah, apologetics, absolutely. It's more needed than ever. I'm so glad that so many of these kind of homegrown talents now, just out of their own bedrooms or whatever, are actually doing much better than many established ministries, you know, actually reaching people through those online means now.
Yeah, I had a conversation with people inside not All Souls Church, St. Helens Bishopgate, about evangelism, about using social media for evangelism, and as part of the case to try and convince them that they needed to focus more on using social media and less on the traditional platform of, hey, come to church, we've got this talk that we want to give you, and it's like all the other talks that we've given this week, you know. They should be using social media. And I asked them, look, you know, on average, how many people do you get contacting you saying, thanks to your talk, I've become a Christian? Or how many? And they said about 2 or 3 a month. So that, you know, they're regularly growing every month. They're bringing people to Christ consistently. But my inbox dwarfs that. But it's not surprising, because I'm speaking to a bigger audience.
Yeah.
You know. Now, with a church like St. Helens Bishopgate, if they did the kind of thing that I'm doing, but then I had a whole team of people doing it and doing the follow-up to all the emails and going out and meeting the people that showed interest, because I've got more requests that I can ever follow up on. Like, if they had a whole team of people, because they can actually resource a team of people, using front-ended social media evangelism with the necessary follow-up, and then placing people in churches that are right for them in their area, or taking them to St. Helens, I am sure that they would grow to a magnitude. There's one of the reasons why the Orthodox churches have come to faith is, you know, because of evangelists like Jay Dyer, Orthodox Shahada, you know, and it really does And you mentioned about the Muslim presence on social media, and you're absolutely right. Because if you look at the demographics, your average age of the Muslim in the UK now is 27. The average age of a Christian now is in their 52 or 53. Yeah. So who's going to be bigger on social media and dictating the conversation on social media? And because social media is the public square for dialogue and discourse, it's not the street, it's social media. That really needs to be where the church is speaking loudest.
I agree entirely. I think the problem the church, it's often been said, that the church is like a dinosaur or something, it's very hard to move, to get it to change direction, once it's traveling in a certain direction. And I think part of the problem, if I'm brutally honest, is that a lot of churches, because it's an older age profile in the average church, they don't understand. They don't know what the opportunity is here. And it's the older age profile that tends to have the money, that tends to resource the ministries of the church, including its evangelism strategies. And so churches, I think, tend to stay in that kind of what we've known safe zone, not realizing the extraordinary potential there is of coming alongside existing evangelistic ministries online, or indeed pioneering their own. And what I would love to see, what I think would be fantastic, is how extraordinary that you, and I'm sure so many others, have so many messages they cannot respond to, but people who are basically open to having a conversation about faith want to. If we could somehow resource the follow-up, what an extraordinary opportunity for evangelism when there are so many people. So I'd say it's not necessarily even about churches developing their own ministries of evangelism. Sometimes it's just about getting behind the people who are already doing an amazing job, who have built a platform, who just seem to have the knack of being able to create viral videos and reach so many people. If that's not your skill set, then support the people who are, and let's kind of try and so yeah, I'd love to see that. If there was a way of sort of building a connection between churches that want to see evangelism done and these people are actually doing it online, and kind of allowing the two to resource each other, wouldn't that be fantastic?
Yeah, but I think it speaks to a deeper issue of that there's a lack of urgency, zeal, and evangelistic spirit within our churches that needs to be challenged. I was speaking to a priest yesterday whose church is an incredibly wealthy church. They've got reserves that are counted in the millions.
Wow.
But the PCC won't release it for anything because they think they need to save it in case the roof falls in one rainy day. And the priest is saying, let me employ a full-time evangelist.
Wow.
And the PCC is saying, no, we're not going to do that. I could tell you a story behind an Orthodox evangelistic effort, where there was an evangelist who I know personally who had brought at least several Muslims to Christ just on his own personal individual efforts. But his church would not make him full-time. And he ended up, by the necessities of life and the need to pay bills and stuff, getting a full-time job that used up all of his time, and his individualistic evangelistic efforts sort of have drained out to almost nothing. Not because he didn't want to do the evangelism, not because he wasn't capable of doing the evangelism, but because his church just didn't see the relevance of seeing the talent and going, hey, we're gonna make this guy an evangelist, we're gonna fund him because he can prove that he does it. And now life has pulled him away from doing that. He's still a committed Christian, of course, but he just doesn't find the time to put in the same efforts that he used to be able to do. And I think there is a battle to be had in our churches, and an argument to be had within our churches about how important evangelism is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ironically, though, something that evangelical churches understand, and yet they're not the ones getting the benefit of the quiet revival, which is an interesting thing.
Arguably, I'd say that's true. And obviously, evangelism is a long game very often, and you know, it's not that you're necessarily going to see bums in seats immediately because of it, and that sadly is often, the bottom line for many churches as to whether it's worth investing, as it were, in it. I think, It is so sad though to hear that story of a church that does have the funding, but is kind of saving it for a rainy day. Yeah, and I can only say, you know, that PCC or whoever will be answerable to Jesus ultimately. What did you do with the talents I gave you? You know, did you bury them in the ground? And it feels like those are resources being buried in the ground.
Interestingly, Justin, that particular church is how what I would describe as an NGO church. So it's a church that thinks that it's there to be a charity to the rest of society, not there to be a representative of the kingdom of God or a Christian community. And so literally they've said to the priest, because he tried to say, look, you know, if we don't do something with this money, at some point the diocese will say, well, we'll have that money and redirect it somewhere else. And their answer was, well, we'd rather give it to a secular charity. So there's clearly members on the PCC that are not, or whose commitment to Christ is not fully discipled.
Yes. And, and that's a fundamental problem at that point. Obviously, a church has developed into something that is clearly not necessarily a church in the standard understanding of the word. Not an organization centered on reaching people for Christ and discipling those who are within it. So that's sad to hear. I've equally seen, you know, sad cases of sometimes small struggling rural churches, maybe only like 5 or 6 people in the pews, but sitting on an enormous pot of money because of some, you know, historical legacies and bequests and things. And but kind of wanting to basically just be shepherded into retirement, or, you know, until the doors get shut. And I just think that's a tragedy, because actually there's so much potential if you were to release those funds for places where there is a missional opportunity, where people are seeing results but maybe don't have the resources, where they would love to employ an evangelist and everything. And sadly, I think it's because so often it's possible in certain Christian circles to kind of circle the wagons and not realize that this was never ours to begin with. This money, you know, it's for the kingdom. It is the reality, though, isn't it? And the reality is, in the final analysis, it's the churches that haven't got that missional viewpoint, that generosity, that spirit of generosity, that are the ones that will eventually close. I mean, that's just the reality. There are churches closing every week in the UK, just as much as there are good news stories of churches that are growing and opening and being planted and so on. And sadly, it's the ones where the you know, the flame has gone out that are the ones which ultimately won't stand the test of time.
And I think there is there needs to be, I would say there needs to be more challenge towards lackluster bishops, lackluster leaders of churches who seem visionless. You know, I heard from the same source, you know, that the bishops of the Church of England have recently had their own sort of gathering around what to do with the quiet revival, and he was one of the attendees, and he was sort of bewailing the fact that they were just sort of scratching their heads and going, well, is it happening? You know, are we sure it's happening? I'm not experiencing it happening. And there was no sense of like wanting to drive anything forward. It just became an academic conversation.
An academic discussion. And that's always the danger, isn't it? It's so much easier to have an academic discussion than to actually get up and do something about it. I mean, I will happily admit that there has been pushback, you know, and it might be worth signaling that to the research we mentioned earlier, the Quiet Revival research. There's been a recent British social attitudes survey that seems to tell the opposite story, essentially, that we're still essentially seeing decline in religiosity, church going and so on. Now, if anyone wants a kind of deep dive into this, I can recommend the final episode of season 2 of my Surprising Rebirth podcast, episode 30, where we do a deep dive on this. I interview Rhiannon McAleer, the co-author of the Quiet Revival research and one of the key critics of the Quiet Revival research, a sociologist called David Vos, who kind of was writing back in the summer about why he doesn't believe these statistics, kind of thing. And I put them essentially 2 separate conversations, but kind of into conversation with each other in the course of this show. And my takeaway was the Quiet Revival research is going to be nuanced. Okay, I don't think it's the full picture. It's a snapshot, and it's using a very specific kind of survey device, which is the YouGov poll mechanism. Now, there are some weaknesses in that. It's got by its nature, it's the kind of thing where you might get sort of some change, you know, some variation, let's say, in what comes through. Having said that, it is used and trusted by a wide variety of organizations, including many secular organizations that are constantly using YouGov. So you can't just sort of discount it, but it's not the gold standard that often sociologists and researchers think of, something like the British Social Attitudes Survey. But as Rhiannon McAleer pointed out in my interview with her, there are also some drawbacks to the British Social Attitudes Survey in terms of the kind of demographic they're capturing and how much they do represent what's actually happening on the ground and so on. So I think there's a conversation to be had there. What I do know, I mean, my overtake was that the quiet revival research doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay. When you look at lots of other metrics, it's symptomatic of something happening. You look at the rise in Bible sales over the last couple of years, both in the UK and USA, that doesn't come out of nowhere. There's people are buying Bibles much more than they used to be.
Yeah, and I don't think it's increase.
And I don't think it's just Christians adding to their current Bible collection kind of thing. I think you look at some of these surveys, you know, other surveys about the way in which atheism is declining among the younger generation. Again, that's not to say they're all becoming Christians, but it fits the pattern. You look at other parts of Europe where very similar surveys have started to note an increased rise in attendance, especially among young men. Lots of Nordic countries, where was it? Sweden just published, a survey showing a really interesting increase in the number of adult confirmations of baptisms, especially among young men. You've had the Catholic revival in France, or what's being spoken of there in terms of the, largest numbers in living memory in the last 2 years of adult converts, essentially, to Catholicism in France, and lots of other kind of bits and pieces, Orthodox boom, all of which to me says there's something going on. Now, it may be nuanced, and it may be that not all the surveys are capturing the same thing. But for me, there's no smoke without fire. And the mistake would be to think, oh, I'm not seeing it in my patch, or I've seen an article that sort of, dismisses this, and think, oh, let's give up. There isn't an opportunity here. There is an opportunity. And that's what I've been seeing and hearing among people on the ground up and down the country. So even if you don't sense it happening where you are, maybe try and get out of the bubble, or whatever it is that you're in. And you might just find there's actually people who are there. So yeah, like you, frustration sometimes when I see on social media someone just quoting an article, kind of dismissing the quiet revival. I'm like, it's not that there isn't a conversation to be had there, but don't just assume, oh, nothing's happening just because you read one article. There's so much more here going on.
Yeah, I think that there is also an element of the culture wars around this, which is that the opponents of the church don't want the church to rally. They don't want the church to have a sense of momentum. They don't want the idea of a quiet revival. And then obviously people like me understand that if you can popularize the idea of new interest, then that itself helps to cultivate new interest. Yeah. And so there's a bit of a weaponization of data.
I agree. But one of the things, what's been most interesting to me in the last couple of years, as I've shared my surprising rebirth thesis, and then you have the quiet revival, is I've just sensed, after a long period of kind of disillusionment in many parts of the church, just a sense of hope and optimism springing up. And I don't think it's an undeserved sense of hope and optimism. I think that there's a genuine thing there. And so I just want to water that, and say, now is the time to be confident and to actually go out and let's not squander this opportunity that God's given us. I don't know how long it'll last. There's
I genuinely think I think months, Justin, and I think don't get me wrong. I'm when I count in months, I'm still counting in years, but like in the same way that we might say a child is 36 months.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah,
it's
you're not expecting decades. Let's put it that way.
That's exactly it. And this is why I have this I mean, personally, I just have this real sense that we have an opportunity to take what are embers, still red embers, and to turn it into a fire. We've got a little spark in a tinder, but we can turn it into a raging flame. I've got my mods telling me that I need to ask people to like and subscribe and to share the links. So there, mods, I've said it. Right, like, subscribe, and share the links if you're enjoying the podcast. Just coming back to this question of how we capture it. So we've said to use the I forget the philosopher's name. We've got a bit of a zeitgeist going on the political right, you know, that's open to Christianity. How much do you think the link between English identity, culture, and it can be used, should be used, and in what ways can it be used, should be used as part of the evangelism of this? Because obviously it's a balancing trick. There are dangers and pitfalls.
Absolutely, and I'm you know these as better than I do, Bob. I think you're potentially probably a little bit less worried than I am about some of them. I'll put it that way. But it's been, as I say, a major area of interest to me in this last season of Surprising Rebirth, the overlap of the political and the religious kind of revival that I think we're kind of seeing. So Christian nationalism, you know, is a word phrase that's been bandied around a lot. The reality is there are different kinds of Christian nationalism, and it's very hard to kind of say there's just one, it's just this one monolithic thing. And I think there are some forms of Christian nationalism that arguably a lot of people are very comfortable with. You know, the fact we have a national church, you know, a Church of England, a established church, is something that I'm quite glad of. I think it comes with problems as well, but I'm kind of glad that, you know, just because of the history of this country, this whole country is divided up into a set of parishes where you kind of are overseen by a parish church, that you have some access to spiritual guidance, counsel, or whatever. Now, that's obviously going to be delivered, you know, to better or less degrees, you know, depending on where you are. But that's part of the Christian culture of this country. I'm kind of very glad that exists. I wouldn't want that to go away. I'm sort of glad that we've got, you know, wonderful historic buildings like, you know, cathedrals and everything else. And I'm glad that still resonates with people. I'm glad that, you know, in the last couple of years, it feels like there's been more and more people wanting to turn up at a church at Christmas, because I think they feel like culture's gone in such a shallow, nihilistic kind of direction. They want something that feels meaningful at Christmas, and church is still a place where people often feel like they can get that. Now, what I'm describing there is still often, you know, under the banner of quote unquote cultural Christianity. And so while I'm saying I'm glad it's there, I wouldn't want that to be where people stop, obviously. And I don't want them to just be a Richard Dawkins style. Well, I do like turning up at carol services, and I'm rather glad the cathedrals are there. Very ironic, given he's tried to spend a lot of his life trying to
empty them out.
Empty them out. I know they're not going to be there much longer if no one goes to them, Richard. But anyway, that aside, I just think I'm glad in that sense for that. There's a kind of cultural Christianity that exists in the country. But if that is the stopping point, obviously that's not enough. You know, we want people to encounter the real Jesus. We want them to have a relationship with God through Christ, and we want people to encounter real Christian faith. So that's kind of where I suppose I'm comfortable with the sense of a kind of Christian nationalism. Now, I think that the forms of Christian nationalism that start to tie your identity to a particular ethnicity, or a very specific kind of version of English or British identity, that's where I get more concerned, because for me, Christ has to, at some level, transcend those ethnic and cultural and national divides. Not that those don't exist, or that we might have good reasons for wanting to celebrate our Britishness or Englishness or whatever. No problem with any of that. But at the point where we sort of tie it too strongly to a Christian identity, I think that is where, you know, I would have a problem, because for me, the church at its best is an exemplar of how Christ brings all the nations and all the ethnicities into one under the identity that they have in Christ. So any identity that sort of puts itself above that ultimate identity in Christ, for me, is problematic. And if they all sit within and under our identity in Christ, then no problem. You know, we're all got certain identities that we can be proud of and want to flourish and everything else. But it's when it's sort of, yeah, if I see sloganeering or marches where people are using Christian symbolism to effectively ostracize or claim that some aspect of what is essentially British or English culture is inherently Christian, I'm a bit nervous of that. I'm sort of, I don't want to baptize that with a sort of being Christian necessarily, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I do. There's nuanced points upon which I'd probably push back, but the general thesis I agree with. So I actually see Christian nationalism. I am a Christian nationalist. I would define myself.
And what do you mean by that then? Because I think
the church is a nation. The church is a nation of the covenant, one born of blood and spirit and baptism, not one of blood and soil. And the blood reference is a reference to the blood of Jesus, not an ethnic blood.
Well, in that sense, I'm a Christian nationalist then. I mean,
exactly.
That we are a holy nation under God.
Exactly. And the point is, the nation of the church exists whether it's in control of the state or apparatus or not.
Right. Okay. Well, this is the key thing, isn't it? Is how does that what does that look like when it's joined to the politics of a nation, of a
absolutely
nation?
And I think one of the reasons why so many churches have gone astray is because they've all got a blind spot in their political knowledge, their political discipleship, so that when they talk about metaphysics, they can be very orthodox, but whenever they lean into politics, they always borrow from the politics of someone else. And the thing is, you can't borrow from the politics of someone else without starting to lean on the other metaphysical framework that undergirds that politics. And so the more heavily you lean on someone else's politics, the more heavily you start to assert their metaphysical foundation. And that's why you've got liberal drift in Methodist churches, Church of England churches, some Presbyterian churches. But then on the Orthodox, you've got drift in another direction in certain Roman Catholic streams, in certain Orthodox streams. You've got drift into sort of alt-right, ethno-nationalist.
And that's why it's possible for Christianity in churches to be captured by both the left and the right. So I agree. I think,
but it's really important to see the reason for that is that because they have not thought out, well, what would a Christian state look like? Whenever they get into politics, they're borrowing other people's politics, and other people's politics are based on other philosophies and other ideologies. And so Christian nationalism, I would argue, and I'd make a very strong argument for a Christian theonomist state or a theocratic state. But the church is a nation regardless of whether it controls the state or not. But if we cultivate the idea of Christian nationalism, or at least a discipleship around the idea of the church as a nation, it allows us to engage with politics as Christians whilst avoiding the pitfalls of both left or right-wing drift. You know, I don't know if I've made myself clear on that.
Again, we'd have to sort of probably spend longer to work out the details of that, because there's bits of it where I'm sort of.
Anytime you want me on your podcast, Justin, you just let me know and I will be there, sir.
It's about. It is a, you know, I suppose I get twitchy when I hear the idea of a Christian theocracy, and because, you know, to some extent, you know, the tradition I inhabit is not actually Church of England. It is a kind of free church. It's something that where the church and the state are quite separate, and I think there's a value to that. But at the same time, I am all for a state in whatever way it functions that is essentially has Christian values, that where Christian values are driving the way that it does its engagement. Now that's where the kind of lines cross between sort of the the church directly having sort of being involved with the political instruments, therefore, of the state is quite blurred very often. And I guess I'm always just wary that very often it's when the church has found itself in the position of having political power that things go off the rails. And to some extent, I think the church has to be very careful of giving itself access to those tools and thinking that it can basically do the job. A certain amount of humility is required, given the history of how that has gone wrong at various points in the past.
I think,
likewise, like if I look over to the States, and apologies if I offend anyone on the live stream here, but I don't like MAGA churches for the same reason that I find churches that have gone in an incredibly progressive direction unappealing as well, because there's a kind of politicization there that has overtaken and swamped the actual Christianity of that church, and I just something's gone wrong in both cases. Do you know what I mean?
I am genuinely finding this conversation interesting, and I would genuinely engage with you in a much fuller conversation with it, either off or on camera, as you prefer. But I want to try and angle this back to the harvest of the Quiet Revival, because I think I actually think that's a much more important conversation.
Fair enough.
But connecting us back to that, I think that if I became aware, for instance, of a debate between Connor Tomlinson, who's the right-wing commentator that appeared on New Culture Forum, and I forget her full name, Birbalsingh, the headmistress of
Catherine Birbalsingh.
Catherine Birbalsingh. I've met them both. They're both lovely people, and I have respect for both and for both of what they're doing. And they had a debate that didn't get published. I think the Spectator was hosting it and decided not to publish it for some reason, in which the debate was, can people become English? And Birbalsingh offered the argument that people could be enculturated into being English, and people took offense at that and said, no, English is an ethnicity. You're born English. You can't learn to be English. And I think that actually there's a middle ground here that we've not properly explored, which is that English culture is an expression of English Christianity, at least up until recently, in the great epoch of English history from before Bede to the present, the vast majority of that time, the English nation, the English ethnos, has been Christian. And so virtually all aspects of our culture are just expressions of Anglican Christianity. And a person can be integrated into an Anglican expression of Christianity. And if we call that English, then people can be integrated into that identity, even if they're not ethnically English. And particularly amongst the English and amongst the English working class, their need for identity, their want of identity, that Tommy Robinson, who I do believe is a genuine Christian, is speaking into, and is open to allowing other Christians to speak into as well. The interface is not going to be in supremely academic arguments, but it is going to be in the totems of identity, and it is going to be in expressions of identity. And if Christians are bold to capture the flag, for instance, like, we've got the campaign about raising the colours at the moment, where Union Jacks have been put up all over the place, and the debate that surrounds that. If the church is bold enough to claim that and go, well, actually, what you're looking there is a flag of the saints, St. Andrew, St. George, St. Patrick, or a Trinitarian flag, it's 3 in 1 kind of. If we claim these symbols, these totems, it would allow us to more effectively evangelize these working class communities that have turned their back for so long on the Christian faith. But we've got to be bold to own it historically, own it culturally, own it politically.
Yeah, and I understand why some churches shrink back from that, because I think very often those flags have been in more recent times used to express a kind of anti-immigrant sentiment, for instance, that I can understand why some churches are like, we don't feel comfortable almost using those flags. Now, I agree, if you could reclaim them and kind of put them to their original purpose and say, look at these amazing saints that are, you know, the historic founders, if you like, of the Christian faith in our country, wouldn't that be wonderful? I think it's really difficult, though, because churches are under all kinds of pressures. And I think if they start to in any way align themselves with the kind of Tommy Robinson kind of stuff, they immediately are opening themselves up to a lot of flack, understandably. So I think that's the difficult thing. Now, as I say, this is a real difficult thing, because on the other hand, I agree with you that we need to be far more creative and intelligent in the way that we do engage working class communities, for whom those may be important totems, as you say, a natural way in which you can encourage someone to think about who they are and their identity. As I say, I wouldn't want those identities. I think the mistake would be if those identities are only being sort of waived as a way of othering other people, or, you know, as an anti-immigration kind of thing, while also totally taking seriously the fact that there have been issues around the way that immigration has been handled that have caused a lot of upset and division and so on in those communities. Somehow, though, the church has that very tricky task of as I say, transcending at some level the politics of all of that, and pointing people towards Christ, who is, you know, whose cross is at the center of many of those flags. I don't know what the answer is. It's a hugely tricky one. What I tend to find most annoying is when people simply dismiss on both sides, you know, those who are trying to do something here. You know, this new show, for instance, that I mentioned at the top, Uncommon Ground, we're genuinely trying to bring together people of very different perspectives on this. I think one of the answers to that is to get your Tommy Robinson sitting down with your maybe more progressive voice in Christianity, and just get them to talk about it rather than talking about each other, you know, in social media. And let's listen to each other and work out whether there is actually a way in which, you know, Christians can genuinely try to understand what a working class person is actually going through, when I may live in a bubble and not really be kind of open to that. And likewise, so I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like conversation is one of the ways in which we could get into that.
Conversation is important, but I do think it would be amiss of me not to point out, and I've got to confess, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder. You know, coming from a working class background, I've often found that the church assumes middle class normativity.
You're absolutely right.
You know, and then when I say something from a working class background, it's just tumbleweeds going across. And it doesn't matter how articulate I am. You know, I'm as erudite as the next middle class toff that you could bring onto a screen. But the reality is, my perspective is firmly rooted in a working class perspective. And it's important, I think, to point out that othering is not just people hoisting the flag. There are lots of Muslims othering the rest of society. There are lots of progressive, middle class, nice Christians othering working class patriots and Christians. So this othering dialogue is not a one-way street. It is going in both directions.
I get that, and I think this is the problem. This is the Achilles heel with a lot of nice middle class Christians who, you know, look at this and don't see both sides of this coin. And you know, absolutely, I think the reason you're seeing the kind of unrest we saw, you know, a year and a half ago in the summer, is because these are not being addressed. These issues are not being addressed in working class communities. They are feeling, you know,
but it's also between, but Justin, it's also between migrant communities.
Absolutely.
You look at Leicester, what happened between the Hindus and the Muslims there. How is that not an example of othering?
Absolutely.
You know, battles between Kurds and Syrians on the streets of Germany. How is that not an example of othering? So my point is, and bringing it back into the harvest, because again, that opens up a new direction, a conversation which would be very interesting, but it's not the focus of today's podcast, is that when it comes to claiming the St. George's flag, you know, this is how I do it. I engage with working class patriots all the time. Here we are, English people celebrating an Armenian saint who never stepped foot in England,
celebrating
him by an English king who was fighting in France for territories in France. Right. And it was in the midst of that war that he elevated St. George to be the national saint, which shows the Catholicity of the church. This idea that to be truly English is to be truly Christian, but to be truly Christian is not to be isolationist.
Right.
Is not to be separatist. Is not to be hermit kingdom-like. You know, it allows us to be informed, be infused, mix with, and be open to a wider set of nations that share a common value, common Christian values, common Christian doctrines. But I don't think, and so if the church wants to reach the working classes, it's got to, and I'll say this, you know, it's got to stop being timid about taking a side.
Right.
You know, there's only one side to take on the issue of child grooming that's happened with the Muslim grooming gangs. There's one side to take. That's the side of the victims. And if you think that there's any obfuscation around that, then check your moral compass. It's that simple. But it's that kind of bolshy attitude that cuts through to working class communities. And I know this from direct experience. You know, you can't do it through endless layers of nuance.
Yes. No, I get that. And I'm sympathetic to that. I absolutely am. I think it's very difficult for some churches to go there, though, because those, for better or worse, some of those issues have become kind of dog whistles for what people consider to be quote unquote far right. You know, I agree. We should be focusing on the victims in the grooming gang scandal. I think the reason those scandals happened was because there was this nervousness around just facing up to the realities of the way in which some types of Islamic communities exist and the kind of values they hold. And that is something that we just have to get a grasp on. We just have to be realistic about and not sort of sweep under the carpet and hope it'll, you know, sort itself out. It didn't. And it resulted in some absolutely awful things happening to girls and women. I think the church has to, I mean, at its best, the church kind of is absolutely honest about what's going on in that way in the culture, but it's also doesn't sort of endorse some of the ways in which people quite naturally tend to respond to that. It doesn't necessarily endorse kind of hatred or whatever. It has to respond in a Christ-like way while absolutely holding up there are terrible things that happen in the name of Islam or whatever it is. So I'd agree with you. I just think it's about what happens next in a way. That's my big question. And how do we make sure that those Christian values truly do look like Christ in the way that we then respond to, you know, some of this stuff that's happening in working class communities.
And I would say, and I do want to move on the conversation to one last thing. Hopefully we can sort of squash it in at the end before giving you final thoughts, because I did promise you a hard exit at 3, and I intend to keep my word. In terms of just as I think that chivalry is the way to avoid toxic Andrew Tate-like masculinity, I think that a well worked out Christian nationalism is the way to engage in a lot of these issues that avoids the pitfalls of drifting into the alt-right or drifting into the alt-left. But that's a conversation we'll have to park.
Like I say, a lot of it would depend, as we've said from the outset, on the definition of Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And
well, like I say, I'll talk to you about that. Another time, on and off the camera, as you wish. But I just want to very quickly, and we don't really have time to explore this properly. So very quickly, one of the things that we touched upon is this idea of an unashamed expression of the supernaturalness of Christianity, and the idea of a deep and serious spirituality. So for you, what does that look like? if you could summarize it?
Yeah, I think it's being absolutely open. Yeah, a lot of my life has been spent kind of delving into the intellectual issues, but I think that can be a hideaway from the fact that God is real, and there's someone on the other end, and that person wants you to have trust that they could actually do things in people's lives. It's about committing to prayer, and committing to the kind of faithful prayer that has an expectation of God moving and doing things in people's lives. The kind of prayer that infuses our own lives with a certain courage and boldness to go and have the kinds of conversations that we might otherwise duck in having with people, and just seeing what God does in the process. So for me, so much of it is about a personal challenge to me to pray and to then act on the basis of my prayers, to go and talk to people, to pray for healing, if that is what the Spirit is leading you to pray for, to pray for the conversion of people who perhaps you have a burden for, to pray for God to reveal himself in supernatural ways to people. And I think there's a kind of, as I say, I think the openness that we're seeing in the culture means that there's a kind of an open door for God to move in those kinds of ways, if we're willing to sort of, act with God in that way. As I say, I think within churches, our church, we can often be very tame or kind of, just play things sort of by the book. And there's no, there should be good order and everything in a church service. I'm not saying we should be swinging from the chandeliers, but a kind of an openness to the fact that God can move, in supernatural ways. I think, it's so interesting that sort of part of this whole quiet revival, surprising rebirth thing has been what I would say is, manifested in that Asbury awakening that got a lot of publicity back in early 2023. And this sense that these were young people desperate for something more than what culture was offering them. And it wasn't showy. It wasn't kind of a sort of celebrity Christian sort of led thing. It was just young people getting on their knees and crying out to God. And I think there's something very powerful about that. And I think I've seen examples of that springing up in other places since. And I just get the sense that there's a kind of desperation, and God can move when people are desperate enough in that way and getting on their knees and praying again.
Amen. I would add to that the church needs to get good at doing the art of existentialism, in moving the self towards Christ as a telos. And if like if we get good at doing that kind of spiritual discourse, it will grant gravitas to the faith, which is the thing that people are looking for. They're looking for something of substance and of gravitas and of meaning. And so that art of existentialism, of moving self towards Christ as end, is the way to do that. Finally, Justin, because I know you've got to go in 3 minutes, have the final word. What do you want to say to the churches, to Christians who are watching this, in regards to the harvesting the quiet revival?
I would say pray. I believe every move of God, be it short term or long term, has been undergirded by prayer. And so this is the time to pray and to ask for God to do, to move in power. There's a kind of, as much as there's all these cultural forces I mentioned earlier, that are moving people into the position of being kind of open to this, I think that goes hand in hand with God moving, when those kind of cultural forces have positioned things. And so let's do this, together with God, not in our own strength. And then just simply for that confidence to go and invite, share, wear our faith on our sleeve, be unapologetic about it, and show people that the meaning, the purpose, the identity that they're searching for can be found in Jesus Christ. Not to settle for anything other than Christ as well. I don't want this just to be a revival of cultural Christianity. Okay. It's great that there's a lot more talk about cultural Christianity, the value of Christian faith. I don't want that to be the stopping point. No, let's invite people to really experience the Christ, not just a kind of some version of Christendom. And yeah, let's keep having these conversations, Bob, because I think, you know, we probably don't agree on everything, but I think it's fantastic that you are reaching who you're reaching, and I want to pray for you and support you and encourage you and learn from you as well as we do that, because we're all in this together, you know.
Well, thank you so much. And as I say, it was you that for me sounded the alarm around this whole issue. And I just hope that more churches wake up to it and get busy.
Yeah.
Get busy. And maybe in today's live stream, you've got some ideas from that. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you.
I said I'd let you go at 3. It is now basically 3 o'clock. So
it's been great to chat with you, Bob. Take care.
Great to talk with you as well.
I'm sure it won't be the last conversation. Take
care.
God
willing. Peace be with you. Take care. Bye-bye. Okay, so as Justin makes his exit, I just want to say to you guys, thank you very much for tuning in. And if you want to get in touch, and feel free to get in touch via email. If you want help in working out an evangelistic strategy and you're the leader of the church, do reach out to me. I'm happy to try and help. I don't charge. There's no consultancy fee or anything like that. And if you think that these live streams are doing good, and after prayer you feel that God is calling you to support the work that I'm doing, please use the links in the description box. With that, I just want to say good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good night, depending on where you are in the world and what time you're watching this. God bless.
Of